Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this Dublin Festival of History event. The Dublin Festival of History is an annual free festival brought to you by Dublin City Council and organised by Dublin City Libraries in partnership with the Dublin City Council Culture Company. And we're delighted to be having in-person events once again here in Dublin Castle. And we're also live streaming over the internet on YouTube, so welcome to those who are watching online. Before we begin, I just want to remind you that you do need to wear a face covering while in the building, except when you're seated here in the auditorium. So if you feel more comfortable without them in the auditorium, please feel free to take them off. I would ask you also to maintain social distancing when moving about the venue. We will have time for questions at the end, but we cannot use handheld microphones. And so we have three fixed microphones on each of the aisles. And if you are selected to ask a question, please make your way to the nearest microphone. We'll be there around about to give you directions. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next event today, Between Two Hells, the Irish Civil War, Diarmaid Ferriter in conversation with Ronan McGreevy. Diarmaid Ferriter has been Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD since 2008. He's the author of several books, is a weekly columnist for the Irish Times, and in March 2019 was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Ronan McGreevy is a news reporter with the Irish Times. He's the editor of Centenary Ireland Remembrance 1916, the official state book recalling the commemorations of 2016, and his book on the assassination of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson will be published by Faber next year. So please welcome Diarmaid Ferriter, Ronan McGreevy.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a fantastic sight to see so many people here after all these months. My guest today is Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, is Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD. I'm sure a person you all know well who are interested in history, and we're here to discuss his new book, Between Two Hells, the Irish Civil War. I suppose, Diarmaid, I could start by saying that this isn't a conventional telling of the story of the Irish Civil War.
No, I remember when I was a student, when I started studying history in UCD, a book by Michael Hopkinson, Green Against Green, The Irish Civil War, was the standard text that we went to for an overview of the Civil War. It's a very fine book, and Michael Hopkinson was a very fine historian, and he was very good at documenting the chaos. He described it as a conflict that had an ill-defined beginning, an ill-defined end, and chaos in between. And in fairness to him, he did a very fine job of documenting the extent of the fighting in different parts of the country and trying to make sense of what was a highly regionalised conflict, as in many respects the War of Independence had been. And it's a particular type of history, that kind of history. So a very fine book. I think what's changed in the meantime, obviously the opening up of archival material. You know, we have access to such a range of material now that wasn't available to historians in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I think sometimes we can do a bit more now to try and find the mental bones beneath the physical flesh of the Civil War. What was the texture of it, not just in relation to the fighting, but in relation to what people were thinking at various stages. You know, what were they recording in private? Sometimes putting that alongside the public rhetoric and the propaganda, which is an intrinsic part of the Civil War, and seeking to make sense, and this is important for me, of its afterlives, of the detritus, of the legacy. How did those who survived deal with the aftermath? And we have really illuminating archival material around that now. So it does offer us an opportunity to ask new questions and seek to answer them. I wasn't going to write about the Civil War unless I had something new to say. And that's where we are an extraordinarily privileged generation of historians to just have so much material at our disposal to try and, I think, reset the parameters of our interpretation of our inquiry. You know, I mentioned that label, Green Against Green. Brother Against Brother was another label often used in relation to the Civil War. And they were understandable titles of their era, but they don't do justice to, I think, the complexity. There were an awful lot of people in between. We often think, for obvious reasons, of the Civil War as being about bringing the polar opposites out in people onto the surface. And brother against brother would suggest, of course, a very male conflict. But we think now about the women. We think about those who were left wavering. One of the most interesting pieces of research that I came across was by Jimmy Wren, the historian, who looked at the GPO garrison in 1916. There were 572 recorded people in the GPO garrison in 1916, not the 50,000 who later claimed that they were there. But of that 572, 41% of them were neutral during the Civil War. That's a very striking statistic. And it's, I suppose, also about those who have to leave, who don't find a future in post-Civil War Ireland. Another very arresting figure for me, it's a part of the country I'm particularly interested in because my ancestors are from there in West Kerry. There were 257 recorded members of Cumann na mBan in West Kerry during this period. And of that 257, 106 of them had left the country by the 1930s. So there is an exodus too. And I was trying to, I suppose, make sense of the reasons why people couldn't find a future there or found themselves very disillusioned about post-Civil War Ireland. But there's also, of course, not just the Southern Irish experience, there's also the experience of those in Ulster. There's a parallel deadly conflict going on, obviously, in the new Northern Ireland. So it is a very complicated picture. It's a very bleak picture, understandably. And yet, we do need to be mindful that we recovered relatively quickly. We put ourselves back together relatively quickly. We hung on to our democracy. There was a strong emphasis on the things that people had in common as opposed to what divided them. And that did facilitate a return to, I won't say normal times for people. It did facilitate, however, a return to a stable democracy that was able to endure further upheavals.
Your book is, we were speaking earlier on, that your book is one of the first books, I think, that has predominantly drawn on the Military Service Pensions Collections Archive, which were first released in 2014. Just for some people in the audience or people watching online, can you tell us what the Military Service Pensions Collection is and why it's such an important archive for us?
There were decisions made in the 1920s to try and compensate those who had been bereaved or those who had suffered loss of livelihood as a result of their service, their active service between 1913 and 1923. There's a whole host of pieces of legislation in the 1920s and the 1930s and beyond, and amending legislation. I won't go into all the technicalities of that. What it amounted to was an attempt to deal initially with the consequences of bereavement and the violence and suffering of the Civil War and the War of Independence, but also demobilisation. There was a really bloated national army at the end of the Civil War in the summer of 1923, over 55,000 members of that army, which was far too big for a state of this size. And they needed to demobilise, they needed to get rid of in the region of 37,000. It's estimated that of that 37,000, about 9,000 of them found employment. Sometimes when you go into the Dublin Diocesan Archive, the archive of the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, you can get a sense of what people were facing. Real destitution. There's a letter there from 1925 from an organisation that was catering for the needs of ex-soldiers who'd been demobilised. And they estimated that between 80 and 100 of those soldiers were sleeping in the Phoenix Park at night. That was the level of destitution. So the pensions process is partly in the 1920s to provide some kind of a subsistence existence for those individuals and their families. And over time it's expanded. When the new Fianna Fail emerges in the late 1920s, they're very, very critical of the pensions process, but they embrace it when they get into power in 1932. And by 1934, it caters for the other side of the Civil War. Initially, the pensions process is for the National Army side, but it's extended to include the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA and Cumann na mBan. So there's a big piece, 1924, the Pensions Act, and then 1934, and a whole host of amendment acts. What it amounts to is one of the most extraordinary archive of conflict anywhere in the world. Yeah. And that it has been released is an enormous positive for historical inquiry. It's also reflective of a very liberal policy in relation to the release of very sensitive and raw material. But you're looking at in the region of 300,000 files. The vast majority of people who applied for pensions were not successful. W.T. Cosgrave in the 1920s, when this process began, emphasised that the bar would be set very high. And the pensions overseers were true to their word. It was set very high. People had to account for what they had done. They also had to detail as much as possible, and it did need to be verified. And there's a lot of luck involved in that in relation to who's still around to verify that. And we know from a government memorandum that in the late 1950s, 57,000 people had applied. 16,000 of them were successful. And then later on, the end of the following decade, about 82,000 applications overall, and 18,000 roughly were successful. The vast majority are disappointed, and it is a catalogue of disappointment. But all of the applications were kept very, very carefully, and they were locked up quite rightly for a very long time. They're being released now in phases. And what is so magnificent about this archive is that this isn't just about military endeavour. No. You get a light shone on medical conditions, on housing conditions, on social attitudes and social conditions, on desperate poverty as well, but also on the different experiences of men and women in different parts of the country and how they are attempting to cope with the aftermath. It's quite a lottery, and there's an awful lot of exasperation and frustration, as well as dignity in these files. It's lovely to be able to read handwritten letters, and even people who are in very desperate circumstances and impoverished can compose very powerful, beautifully written accounts of their plight and what has happened to their families and why they feel they are deserving of a pension. And most people were awarded a pension at the lowest level. I mean, it's graded A to E. The vast majority of people are being awarded the lower grades. That might mean for some of them maybe £22, £23 per annum, the equivalent maybe of €5,000 or €6,000. So people were not going to get wealthy on the back of these pensions, but for some it would keep them above water.
Well, we could spend this whole day just talking about individual pension applications. I think one that will really stuck in my mind and still does to this day when I was looking through the pension files is that of Charles Haughey's father, John Haughey. Just tell us a little, because he features in your book. Tell us a little bit about his situation.
Well, John and Sarah, his wife, were both very active in Derry, in the Common Man and in the IRA. John ends up on the National Army side, and to cut a long story short, really has a breakdown during the Civil War. He has responsibility for a lot of different troops in Mayo, and we know from his application that he had some kind of a breakdown in the midst of civil war. He's described as highly agitated, and you've got to decode a lot of the language that's used in the 1920s and the 1930s in relation to what people are suffering mentally. They don't use the language that we use today, and there's often reference to people's nerves or their agitation, but they were trying to link his experiences during the Civil War to his development subsequently of MS, and he becomes desperately sick. He has to resign his commission in the National Army. He attempts to try and run a farm at some stage in Dunshaughlin, but they end up moving then to back to a part of Dublin where the young Haughey is reared. It's a big family, and they are completely impoverished. What we get in the correspondence of the Military Service Pension Archive is an application for a disability pension as well as a military service pension. And he eventually qualified for that, but it came very late, and he, by the end of his life, was incapable of leaving the bed or any kind of independent living. It's very distressing to read that kind of material. It's replicated across the country and across different groups of people. It does make you think about how Haughey's character and attitudes may have been forged in childhood. And I'm not a psychoanalyst, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but it's an obvious question to ask about whether that degree of privation can have a profound psychological impact on people and may certainly affect their behaviour and their attitudes to various things. And I don't need to lay that on with a trowel in relation to Charles Haughey and his taste for the finer things in life. Is there a connection? There probably is. But what that story is, first and foremost, is a story of the terrible distress that was caused by the conflict and the way it manifests itself, where people get very ill. And that's what I mean about a medical history. You do get specific references to traumatic neurosis and what we would label today post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are some who manage to get medical testimony to the effect that they can trace this back to their experiences. They were very young, a lot of these men and women. George Lennon is another interesting character who was with the IRA in Waterford at the time of the fall of Waterford City at the beginning of the Civil War. And he was barely out of his teens. And he was traumatized by what happened. And when you go through his pension application, he lived such a long life. He was still alive at the age of 90. He began practicing Zen Buddhism in the United States. He was still seeking some kind of peace or inner peace. About 10 or 11 changes of address. And eventually medical testimony becomes a part of his various updated applications for a disability pension, that what he is suffering from can be traced directly back to the War of Independence and Civil War. So for many it's about carrying those mental scars for the rest of their lives. And you can see it in the women as well, who have particular challenges when it comes to making the case for a pension. They're confined to the lower grades, D and E, because they're deemed to be an auxiliary force coming a man, which, according to their definition, they were. But it becomes very heated at times for many of these women, trying to prove that the work that they were engaged in had a profound effect on them mentally and physically, whether they were enduring soakings, and many were suffering from TB, or were harbouring men on the run, high-risk activity, but it was not deemed often to be active service because it didn't involve firing a gun. And there's a lot of resentment about that. Nora Martin was very vocal about the overseers of the pensions process being all male. And she admonishes them in 1940, saying, it's impossible for you to visualize the feelings of these women. And she describes what these women were facing, not just in relation to the work that they did during the conflict, but the cultural barriers that they were facing, the sexism that they were facing. It was doubly difficult for many of them. And she was writing on behalf of Ellen Carroll, who was described, she was a Cumann na mBan activist in Cork who ended up working in London during the Second World War in a sorting office during the Blitz. And she's described as a complete wreck. And it is striking how often that phrase is used, a complete wreck. And you're talking about people who are still young, in the 1930s and 1940s. These are not old men and women, but they have been prematurely aged.
Yeah, you talked about there at the beginning about the cliche of brother versus brother, but actually, as you say, women had a very significant role to play in the Irish Civil War. I think all the women, 6 women were in the Dáil. They all voted against the treaty. Just tell us a little bit about the impact that the Civil War had on the women who became anti-treaty.
I became very interested in the long-term effects of hunger strikes. A lot of women go on hunger strike, over 90 of them. There were a lot more women incarcerated during the Civil War than had been during the War of Independence. And I write somewhat wryly that women had finally achieved equality in September 1922 because the instruction to the prison authorities is don't make any distinction of sex, and many of them were dealt with very violently. But there's over 500 of them incarcerated and over 90 of them go on hunger strike. And I think we often think about hunger strikes that are taken to death and the devastation that's involved in that. But there were a lot of women who were on hunger strike for maybe up to 30 or even 40 days. And many of them were carrying the after effects of that for the rest of their lives. One doctor describes an ideal specimen of womanhood, a woman in her early 20s prior to her hunger strike. And she dies a couple of years later from the effects. It's a combination of exposure and hunger strike. And those kind of incidents. But it's also about them dealing with the attempt to dehumanize them. The propaganda war is ratcheted up in relation to women. And this is about what's said publicly but also privately. Liam de Rochta, who was a pro-treaty Sinn Fein TD in Cork, kept a marvellously detailed diary throughout the Civil War. And he refers to the women who were on hunger strike as not normal beings who don't think in a normal way. He described them as monomaniacs. And there is this concerted effort, publicly and privately, to try and depict these as hysterical and incorrigible and incapable of rational thought. And P.S.R. Hegarty at a later stage goes so far as to deem women responsible for the ferocity of the Civil War because they were incapable of rational thought. And you can see how that, strips them of their humanity and of their reason. And Mary McSweeney is often held up as the ultimate example of this.
Yes.
And of course she takes on church and state during the Civil War because she goes on hunger strike in November 1922. She is the keeper of her brother's flame, Terence, who famously died on hunger strike during the War of Independence as the Mayor of Cork. But she's also very much her own woman. She takes on church and state because the church is not allowing her to receive the sacraments. She takes on Edward Byrne, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin. But she also specifically refers to her struggle as a woman and what I am dealing with here, and the refusal of the authorities to recognise the right of women to have these deeply held convictions and to take the protests that they were taking. So women are facing a lot of that at the time, but then also obviously the sense after the Civil War that they need to go back to their rightful place, that they have prescribed duties, that those duties are in the home. There's quite a hostility to the idea of women in public life. Obviously there were women in the Dáil who were regarded as just spokespeople for the dead, for their dead relatives. But the way Ada English put it, and she had no dead relative to throw in your teeth, as she put it. She was a doctor. These were highly intelligent, highly educated, qualified people, many of them. And they felt this abandonment very deeply. There's a terrible line from Sheila Humphreys, who was another Republican activist, about the aftermath. And she said, we were so flattened, and we felt that the public had forgotten us. And we were wearing the Republic, she wrote, like a tattered garment around us. That feeling of complete deflation. And even, one of her colleagues who had written a memoir about this period, Maura Comerford, who again became a very well-known vocal anti-treaty Republican, she couldn't get her memoir published. They were untouchable in some ways. They were not regarded as people you could do business with.
Why do you think it is that Cumann na Mban, I think was alone among the major Republican organisations to go, not just anti-treaty, but overwhelmingly anti-treaty, I think about 90-10 or something, or 85. Why was it that so many active Republican women were against the treaty, do you think? Mary
McSweeney wrote about this, again invoking the name of her brother, and she quoted Terence McSweeney in his book, The Principles of Freedom, that it was up to women to keep men on a pure path when it came to the depth of their Republican faith. And let's remember that an awful lot of these convictions are framed in a quasi-religious language, or a fully religious language, that this is about spirituality, that it's about faith. And some of the women certainly do feel that there's an onus on them because of their gender to be seen to be particularly pure when it came to the Republican faith. That's part of it. Also, when it came to the Cumann na Mban Convention, where they voted so overwhelmingly against the treaty, most of the delegates, who were not going to vote against the treaty, stayed away. Who were going to vote in favour of the treaty stayed away. It's a bit skewed. But you also have a lot of the Cumann na Mban delegates are from parts of the country where there was particularly strong anti-treaty sentiment. And there is a drop-off. About 12,000 Cumann na Mban women are active during the Civil War. A drop-off of a couple of thousand from the War of Independence. So it's a combination of different factors. Women became very responsible for the propaganda output of the anti-treaty side, and they're very active in that work. But even on the other side, and we forget sometimes about the pro-treaty women, the assistant military censor for the National Army side was Patricia Hoey, who was a suffragette. Nobody really remembers Patricia Hoey now. And she wasn't successful in her pension application, even though she had plenty of referees. And what the referees said, that she was doing a man's job. So even then they defined her in terms of men. So there are women who, on the other side, who are involved in Civil War work and in Civil War propaganda work. But a lot of the experiences of women, the anti-treaty women, it really is about attempting, as they would see it, to keep the opposition to the treaty going. There's very tortured correspondence between Eamon de Valera and Mary McSweeney. They have an interesting bond, and de Valera is frustrated with Mary McSweeney because he just finds her not amenable to reason. He likes to pride himself on being rational. Others may have had other views about that. But he sees her as being in another category. And whilst he can admire the depth of her Republican faith, he can't match it. And you can see with the men as well, you can see that in Ernie O'Malley. I mean, Ernie O'Malley's Civil War letters, his prison letters, are really revealing about an individual who thinks the country hasn't suffered enough. We have not been through enough voluntary sacrifice. We have to get back our soul. We have to understand the depth of these convictions. I mean, at one stage, Frank Gallagher says, as a result of the treaty divide, that Ireland is not land or people. Ireland is spirit. Ireland is the dead and the things the dead would have done. It can be difficult to argue with that. There are others, of course, who are countering that argument by saying Ireland has to be about the living. It's time for the living.
I think Michael Collins said that during the
Michael Collins said it, Kevin O'Higgins
yes.
said it as well, that you can't sacrifice people's lives to carry on a tradition. So, you know, there are two very strong arguments running in opposition to each other when it comes to that question of faith. And TDs like Frank Fahey would have said in the Dáil debates, well, have we just been playing at republicanism? But then what was republicanism?
Yes.
You know, I mean, Michael Collins was asked by Carl Ackerman, a US journalist and sometime British spy during the War of Independence, about that.
Yeah.
And he said none of us have ever defined a republic. They were separatists, many of them, before they were Republicans.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that they hadn't necessarily worked out the bones of what an Irish republic might look like. Their primary focus is on getting rid of Britain. And De Valera did suggest there was wriggle room in August 1921, before the treaty negotiations, when he said we're not Republican doctrinaires as such. And that idea that, you know, what had been mandated in 1918, the general election for Sinn Fein, was for a republic, but that they would be free, if they achieved that republic, to think about other forms of government, to try and incorporate as many viewpoints as possible. But you see, the problem by the time of the outbreak of the Civil War is that many would see that as abstract, an abstract dogma. And most people don't live their lives according to abstract dogma. And it does become a sticking point. You know, those who are regarded as betraying the Republic, I mean, that's a very emotional issue for a lot of people, and it's very genuine, the feeling of betrayal. But the actual debate about what a republic might look like, Ernie O'Malley had no interest in politics. You know, and you know, when he's asked to stand as a Sinn Fein, a TD, while he's incarcerated, he's not interested in the politicians. And the way Liam Lynch would have said it is that it was up to the military men to hew the way to freedom for politicians to follow. Well, and there's a distinction to be made, I suppose, between those who are thinking like soldiers and those who regard themselves more as politicians. And you can see them during the Dáil debates. Cathal Brewer refers at one stage to the men who matter. Who are the men who matter? Soldiers.
I suppose one of the things that it seems to me about the Civil War, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, is you do talk about Ernie O'Malley, and one quote that I really struck out with me was you talked about his arrogant conviction that it was unnecessary to consult the feelings of the people. You have De Valera's notorious comments that the people have no right to do wrong. Was the Civil War, I mean, given that in June 1922, the election just before the Civil War, 6 days or 12 days before the Civil War, approximately 80% of the people voted either for pro-treaty side or those who, like the Labour Party and the Independents and the Farmers Party, wanted to get on with things. So do you think in some ways that it was, is it too simplistic to say it was a civil war between one side that wants to implement the will of the people, which is to get on with the treaty and get on with things, and those who don't believe that the will of the people matter?
Well, the biggest block of votes in the June 1922 election actually went to neither side of Sinn Féin.
Yes.
It went to the combination of all the others,
Yes.
Labour and Independents and Farmers candidates, which suggested that people were preoccupied with bread and butter issues, alongside the big debates of the day about the oath and about the hated compromises, that, you know, people do have to get on with their everyday lives. And Liam de Rochester refers to that in his diary as well. You know, for all the people who are passionately engaged in intense debate about the rights or wrongs of the treaty, there are an awful lot of people who are much more concerned with the fight for material survival. So we do have to factor that in with regard to how people may have been thinking in the summer of 1922. As regards the will of the people, there were certainly no shortage of accusations at the time that the will of the people was being ignored by the anti-treaty Republicans. And some of them do have a contemptuous attitude to the public. There's no doubt about that. They've been in a bubble in many respects.
Yeah.
We have to understand the way they were living their lives.
Yeah.
And there's something that's very difficult for a lot of them to make a transition to thinking in a different way.
Yeah.
And, you know, many of them have been on the run. Many of them have been used to deference and obedience, including Eamon de Valera,
Yes.
who can't cope with the loss of his standing and his status and his authority. So there is that, but there are also those on the pro-treaty side who can be equally contemptuous of the public and can be particularly contemptuous of the women who we mentioned a few moments ago. I don't think any side has a monopoly on democratic will or virtue. Certainly anti-treaty Republicans, some of whom became much more entrenched as the Civil War went on, became ever more dismissive of the idea of the people, that they knew best. And again, they were used to dominance and they were used to imposing their will on people. That's part of it. But then at the same time, Kevin O'Higgins, for example, who, you know, becomes, I suppose, one of the strong men of the 1920s governments before he's assassinated in 1927, his argument was that the will of the people had to take precedence over everything else, and that the welfare of the people was the ultimate law, that there aren't any laws during Civil War except the welfare of the people. But then there's a debate, of course, about the extent to which that moved beyond the rhetoric. Once you start executing people, which is another very important part of this conflict, you can go on executing people on the grounds that what's at stake is existential. It's about the survival of the state. And once you've made the mental leap that you are going to do this, you can keep on doing it. There's a very chilling line at one stage from W.T. Cosgrave when he tells the neutral IRA, and there is a neutral IRA who shouldn't be forgotten, if I have to execute 10,000 Republicans in order for this state to survive, I will. And he would have. And I had, a couple of years ago, had an opportunity to listen to Liam Cosgrave, who, of course, took up the mantle of leadership at a much later stage in the 1970s. And he so robustly defended the policies of the executions as being absolutely necessary and enabling the country to survive. So that feeling was very strong on the pro-treaty side. And yet, that's, again, not necessarily the only view on executions. There were those who really struggled within the pro-treaty side, really struggled with this. There are a lot of references in the private diaries to the new distrust and the way people are looking at each other and the way people are interacting. I mean, it adds an added emotional barrier or emotional complication for many people. And there were a lot of references in the diaries to, again, the idea of a kind of a moral ulcer. You know, that things are happening now that are unspeakable and were unimaginable, particularly for people who have been fighting on the same side up to the summer of 1921. How could they be doing this to each other? And exploring the implications of that, not just for those involved in politics and soldiering, but for families that are riven, for communities and parishes. I think it's one of the reasons why we get so many silences, which are not necessarily ignoble.
Yes.
That can be a way of people dealing with trauma, not wanting to exacerbate the tensions and the fault lines that have built up because of what happened in 1922 and 1923. But what strikes you with the pension archive, I suppose, is just how the class differences become so exposed through the process, where some of the individuals associated with some of the excesses of 1922 and 1923 can slip quite comfortably back into civilian life. They can do quite well, they can get quite hefty pensions, I'm thinking of Paddy O'Daly, for example,
yeah.
from the Dublin Guards, who was associated with many of the atrocities in Kerry in the spring of 1923. His portrait ends up in the Hugh Lane Gallery. He's eminently respectable. He goes back to a good job. He gets a pension of £280 a year. But what I tried to do was trace some of the victims of the Cahersiveen outrage or Ballyseedy or Knocknagoshel on the National Army side. What became of them? These were working class recruits. You know, sometimes you are transported from a wood in Kerry to a tenement in Gloucester Street because the soldiers are from Dublin and their families have to deal with the loss of their breadwinner. That's the lottery as well that I'm talking about. And there are, of course, bureaucratic cruelties. One of the victims of Knocknagoshel, Edward Stapleton, for example, left 2 young children and a widow and also his mother in a tenement in Gloucester Street. He'd worked as a foreman in Easton's. And of course, they're desperate for money, and eventually they get a modest payment. And one of the kids then dies a couple of years later. Died from what was very common, of course, in that part of Dublin at the time, from TB. And the Department of Finance recoups the month that was paid in the pension for the month after the child died. Sometimes when you read that, you understand how cruel bureaucracy can seem. But at the same time, as the bureaucrats would have seen it, if this process was to work, they had to try and detach themselves from the emotion of these situations. But when you're going through this material, it's very difficult not to be emotional. Everything about the Civil War is emotional.
Yes.
I remember when I started studying history in the late 80s, early 90s, A.T.Q. Stewart, who was a renowned historian of Ulster and Unionism, said people have to stop writing history without the emotion. And he was talking about different things like the famine and that. You know, you can't write about this in a kind of a technocratic way. You know, we need to understand how emotion is sweeping through all of these subjects, and none more so, of course, than the Civil War. There are attempts, obviously, to rein it in afterwards.
I suppose the next year is obviously the centenary of the start of the Civil War. I think fundamentally, when we come to debate this subject, I guess the morality or otherwise of the executions carried out by the National Army, and also Ballyseedy, which was a notorious episode where 8 IRA prisoners were tied to a landmine and blown up. Only one of them survived.
And called Irish bastards
yes.
before they were blown up.
And this was done in the name of the state, I think. And obviously by modern standards, you can't justify the executions of 77 people, let alone one person, let alone. But I'm just wondering, do you think that's an important part of the debate next year, to talk about the morality of these executions by the state in the context of the time in which they happened?
Yeah, context being crucial. And I mean, part of the reason why I wrote this book was precisely to try and confront these very difficult issues. It's not about us being excessively judgmental or suffocating that generation in judgment. We know what happened afterwards. I was thinking 100 years ago, this weekend, when you consider those who were going over to begin the negotiations that led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, that led to the Civil War. We know what happened next.
Yes, of course.
Let's try and put ourselves in the shoes of those who don't know what's going to happen next. I know that's difficult to do, but it does perhaps offer an opportunity for us to dilute the potency of some of our judgments and try and appreciate that things were not always clear-cut and that the depths of feeling were so strong. But at the same time, you've also got to consider, of course, that question, morality. And I'm a bit wary of it, because how do you define it today? How do you approach it today? Clearly, there were things that were done during the Civil War that were illegal, that were extrajudicial, that were about vengeance and revenge, and were visceral, and the hatreds were visceral. And again, it's not about balancing both sides. I mean, this is a very uneven contest in some respects, given that the resources that the pro-treaty side have and the National Army have greatly outweigh the anti-treaty Republicans. And yet the anti-treaty Republicans found ways of course, to cause huge problems and carnage on their side. So it's not about an exact equivalence between them. We've got to look at the dynamics of the conflict and what was available to them at the time. Ultimately, we cannot find an easy answer around morality, which is why I'm trying to look at the language that was being used at the time. What did they feel they were doing? Frank O'Connor was a very young internee who went on to become a renowned Cork writer. And he got fed up with what he regarded as the abstract mysticism of some of his fellow internees. He wanted to hear music. He wanted to hear children laugh. And he said before that, I rarely thought, I felt. That's a very accurate summation of where a lot of them find themselves. And then when they do begin to think about various things, they discover there are other things that they want. Sean O'Phelan wrote about this as well. It was about the Civil War waking us up from the mesmerism of the romantic dream. And the writers did this very well. I mean, Sean O'Casey did it as well. You need to be careful of personal idealism. Good as it may be and well-intentioned, its flame in a few hearts may not give rise to new life and hope for the many, but dwindle into ghastly funeral pyres. And he's writing about the tenements. What changed for the people he described as the inanimate patsies of the tenements? There were 800,000 of them, people in Ireland living in overcrowded conditions in 1926. So the argument that he's making is that it didn't change things for those people. So when we talk about morality, we don't just have to think about the specific atrocities that you've mentioned. You know, we need to think about all those other contextual issues. And I would be very wary of coming up with a definitive judgment or a definitive answer. It's about seeing them through the lens of their era, the lights that guided them. And clearly, we can make our own decision about what they did and the appropriateness of it. What we have to avoid doing, I suppose, is transporting our early 21st century values back to 1922.
This is true, but you do see at the time, even at the time, you see the Labour leader Thomas Johnston standing up in the Dáil Éireann time after time, especially after the Hales killing the 4 guys that were killed the following day. They were just taken out and shot. I mean, there was no pretense that no pretense that you did. And you know, you're saying, well, we can't judge them by the standards of our time, but even by the standards of that time. Thomas Johnston, who had no dog in that fight.
No,
he thought it was wrong.
He was, and Johnson was very courageous. And the Labour Party were courageous during that period. And they were also providing the only meaningful opposition voice in the Dáil, because the anti-treaty Republicans were not taking their seats. And whilst they were contemptuous, many of them, of politics, including Liam Lynch also wanted to use individuals in the Dáil when he thought it would be helpful in terms of propaganda for the other side. And Thomas Johnston absolutely said there was no pretense at legality. He said, you have strangled the new state at its birth. And that'll give you an idea of how high the emotions were running. The failure to consult families. People getting telegrams to say that their loved ones had been executed earlier that morning, getting the telegram later in the afternoon. That's how they find out. And Richard Mulcahy was having none of the idea that they would give them advance notice. So yes, absolutely we can make our assessments and our judgments about those kind of cruelties. And we do need, of course, to consider what was involved in the compartmentalization, if that's what it was, that people were able to become cold and detached in relation to this. You mentioned Sean Hales. Sean Hales was killed, of course, in December 1922. The Free State has just formally come into existence a year after the treaty. But I got interested in the Hales family as well, not just because of that assassination, but because his brother Robert was on the other side. And his pension application is a desperate tale of privation, of premature death. And he said, I couldn't go home. So he's on the run. And a lot of these people are on the run afterwards. So, I mean, within those particular experiences and those executions that you're talking about, you're finding extraordinary cruelties heaped on cruelties. And also people being unable to settle. Whether that's the mother of Rory O'Connor or the family of Patrick Tuhig, who was a railway worker in Inchicore. You know, these aren't the household names. You know, we remember those who were executed in December 1922. But when you begin to look at the rest of them, you can see how there is also a lesser value attached to working class lives. What do I mean by that? Well, consider Erskine Childers.
Yes.
Erskine Childers, the people got advance notice. A very high profile execution. But there's an element of class working there, that there was pressure because of his status. He was obviously a former senior British civil servant, a renowned author. And you can also find acts of generosity, that he shakes the hands of those who are about to execute him, that he gets the Erskine Jr., who's only a teenager, 16, to promise that he will devote himself to reconciliation, that if he does find the people who executed his father, that he'll shake their hands. Again, there's great nobility in that. So I suppose I'm conscious that in all the bleakness and the attitudes that harden and calcify and that bleak vista, you do find pockets of humanity. You do find moments of great courage. Stephen Fuller, miraculously, when the Ballyseedy mine exploded, was blown so far away that he survived with very severe burns, and he was traumatised for the rest of his life. But he refused to become a poster boy for the anti-treaty side. He became a Fianna Fáil TD briefly, but he never spoke about it. He would not speak about it publicly, and he carried his trauma with a quiet and noble dignity. And many people were able to do that. So we do need to be conscious of the efforts and the lengths that people went to try and come to terms with this, but also to try and not exacerbate, I suppose, the existing enmities as they existed.
It's interesting that obviously, we have we Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael in power now, if the government holds, and that's a big if, but let's say they do, who will be in power marking the centenary next year. So you have, and interestingly enough, right up to December next year, Micheál Martin is Taoiseach, and then Leo Varadkar takes over. And Leo Varadkar said Ballyseedy shouldn't have happened. So those atrocities will be, commemorating those atrocities, the centenary of those atrocities will be on his watch. Now, is there anything to be said for a state apology or a state acknowledgement for some of the stuff that was done in the name of the state 100 years ago?
There is, but where do you stop? Where do you begin and where do you stop? I think what will probably transpire instead of apologies is a theme of reconciliation. That you choose a day where the dead of the Civil War can be remembered. Todd Andrews was later to write about the Civil War, and he was only a teenager when he was interned during it. There's no glory in Civil War. There are no monuments to the victors and to victory, only to the dead. You don't celebrate Civil War. You remember, you commemorate as you see fit. Is that about picking a day where you bring both inheritors of the different sides together, and they are actually formally sharing power now in that political sense? You bring them together and you have a day of reflection, a day of discussion, a day of, you would hope, honest confrontation and nuanced remembrance. But at the same time, you've got to allow people to commemorate as they see fit. And there are always going to be people who want to do it in their own way. Sinn Fein have often had a kind of a parallel commemorative agenda that's separate from the state, and they'll continue to do that. There are local groups who are devoted to events that happened in their districts. There's brilliant work that goes on at local history level and through the local authority libraries. The state should not be directing in that sense, that there will be an onus on the state to find a way to mark the Civil War and to discuss it honestly. Some might feel, and some will demand, I'm sure, apologies for specific instances.
I think Sinn Fein already have done it.
Yeah, and there could be a long list.
Yeah.
When you consider all of the various horrible events of the Civil War. But will that take you too far into layers and layers and layers of demands for apologies that in many respects are going to take us away from other ways we could be looking at the Civil War and seeking to understand it more? That you don't just want the focus to be on the Ballyseedies or the Knocknagoshals. That you want something much more rounded. Those events will always stand out in the hierarchy of Civil War remembrance. But what I would hope is that people would remember the kind of people I'm writing about in the second half of the book in particular. These were people who, whatever side they were on, they devoted much of their youth and their vigour and their conviction to these causes. And for many of them, it was the defining era for them. I was reading a memoir there by Liam O'Brien, who opted out of the Civil War, but he said 1922 never left me. You know, it marked people, men and women in a particular way, and it would be nice to think about those people.
I always think that the historical events, I put them in two categories. One, their history, as in what happened, it doesn't really matter in a contemporary setting, or else their current affairs. When I'm thinking about partition, 100 years, partition is still as live a subject now as it was 100 years ago, as we've seen from the fallout over the President's decision not to go to Armagh. But is the Civil War, in your view, history that we can put behind us, or is it still current?
Oh, the Civil War is both. I mean, what strikes me, of course, about the sensitivity relation to the Civil War is how it can clash with current affairs. Not so much now, to the extent that was apparent in the post-Civil War decades and the earlier decades of the state's existence. Now, sometimes we exaggerate the extent to which Dáil proceedings were dominated by the Civil War. You know, Sean Lemass, as I mentioned, was very quiet about the Civil War, and of course his brother Noel had been savagely mutilated and killed even after the end of the Civil War. But he described his colleague Sean T. O'Kelly as always looking for an opportunity to climb up the pole and shout the Republic from the rooftop. And he took the bait, you know, and he was goaded. And that worked. I remember reading the memoir of Noel Brown when he went in to the Dáil in 1948. And he was struck by how Ballyseedy and 77 were being shouted across the chamber, and he described it as the white-hot hate of the Civil War, that it was still there, obviously, and it, you know, and they were the Civil War generation, but you know that wasn't happening week in, week out, and people did find a way to deal with it. It frustrated some who felt that a lot of the energies of the Civil War and of Civil War politics could have been expended more effectively in other areas. Like James Dillon used to castigate what he described as the codology of politics in this chamber. What ideological differences, if words retain their meaning, divide any two deputies on either side of this House, which was a fair point because it was the nomination of a new Taoiseach. And, you know, again, where were you in 1922? And it was actually brought up by a Labour Party TD initially. So there was that. The potency and the sting and the heat went out of it to a certain extent because the Civil War generation passed. But what I found very revealing was just the depth of the antipathy that existed towards independence. John Lemass couldn't abide the independence. He was very tribal in his thinking, and a lot of those politicians were very tribal in their thinking. But you could still see the tensions with the Supply and Confidence Agreement. You know, the way you'd have individuals who would be niggling away in relation to what they would regard as certain of the cultural inheritances of this period. The Clongowes boys versus the Christian Brothers boys in politics. And then the women who are saying, yeah, it is the boys, that's the problem, you know, and perhaps things wouldn't have got as bad if more women had been in public life and politics. So it does, and I mean, that's only a couple of years I'm talking about.
I think Micheál Martin, was he saying, I think he was saying that there was, before the 2020 election, that basically there was a class bias that, you know, I think a lot of the Fine Gael politicians didn't know what it was like to struggle and stuff like that. And he said he was making a lot of growing up in a council.
But I mean, that's partly the Civil War legacy as well, in that Micheál Martin, when he took over the leadership, would have made much of his background, his father as a bus conductor. And what the argument he was making is that we need to go back to our foundational aims, you know, to our original mission as a radical party in the late 1920s. And what was said in 1932 by one of the Fianna Fáil TDs was that this was about not just a change of political guard, it was about a change of class. Now that was exaggerated too, but there was an element of truth in it when you look at the people who felt they had no stake in the country or who felt disenfranchised.
Men and no property.
You know, the men, they did go to Fianna Fáil, you know, and Fianna Fáil built up a very loyal and durable support base in both urban and rural areas when it came to housing and the small farmers and so on. So, I mean, that class alliance was real. And, of course, the complexion has completely changed now because a lot of that Fine Gael and Fianna Fail, have lost a lot of that ground, and Fianna Fáil particularly have lost a lot of that ground for obvious reasons with the rise of Sinn Fein. People like Sean Lemass liked to say that there was no real need for a Labour Party in Ireland because we're the real Labour Party. And they did steal a lot of the Labour Party's agenda and clothes when you go back to the 1930s. So there is that, but where we are now, 100 years on, I suspect there might be quite a lot of references to how far we've travelled, but it took a long time.
I have one more question. No, Bert wants to get some questions from the floor. I just have one last question of my own to ask you. We've been speaking for nearly an hour about the Irish Civil War. I never mentioned Michael Collins, but you do talk in the book almost like about the cult of Michael Collins, that he's that mythical character that Ireland would have been a different country had he lived. You think that there's an element of scepticism.
Michael Collins did not live on a different ideological planet than his colleagues, and we have to remember that. He was extraordinarily talented and able, and he was probably most effective as an administrator, as an organiser, as a minister. He frequently cajoled his colleagues for not being as smart as he was and not working as hard as he did. But he also had a conservative streak in him. And historians like Anne Dolan and William Murphy have done a fine job in the limited amount of material that he left behind to try and uncover the extent of his ideological leanings, if any. And they're very slim. So I don't buy the idea that Ireland would have been a transformed place. Sometimes when you look at what he did leave behind in the collected speeches of Collins, The Path to Freedom, which was published just after his death, his meanderings are very similar to one Eamon de Valera's when it comes to the idealisation of the West, when it comes to what Ireland can become again, by going back to Ireland's ancient customs and spirit. But he also ensured, of course, that the Department of Finance was a very powerful government department, which, of course, it remained. The idea that there would have been a completely different ideological complexion to governments that might have been led by Michael Collins, I find a bit far-fetched. But there's an inevitability around that what-ifery because of the fall of an icon. And Michael Collins was a very famous man in 1922.
And he was only, people forget he was only 31.
He was very young, and he didn't have everything worked out. None of them did. But there was certainly a great ability there. I mean, some Fianna Fáil politicians were later to make the argument, including David Andrews, that, there were those wings within the Fine Gael party, that there were different wings, that there were those who would have been more open to more ideological, a greater ideological range. And again, you can take that for what it's worth. But again, singling out the lost leader as the answer, as the salvation, is always highly problematic and deeply romantic.
But, is there any questions from the audience? Please approach. There are 3 microphones. This that gentleman there. Could you just, Brendan will show you to the microphone. Thanks. Could you give your name, please? Thank you.
Sorry, my name is Thomas Dempsey. Just a quick question. Are we grown up enough to face the reality of what the Free State did during the Civil War? I mean, we give out about, what am I trying to say? We give out about the Black and Tans, and we give out about the auxiliaries, but we had our own version of the Black and Tans, and in my view, the auxiliaries with the Special Infantry Corps in 1922 or 23, and in my view, the Dublin Squad would be our version of the auxiliaries. I mean, we look at what happened with Oriel House, for example, and just what's committed there. And I actually read the cover-up over the Ballysheedy massacre that was in the National Library. And I was struck how similar it was to what happened with Bloody Sunday in 1969, the cover-up there. So do you think we as a society can face the really horrible things that was carried out in the Civil War on our behalf by the national government?
You're absolutely right about the replication of black and tan methods. It crops up again and again. I mean, the accusation is made about both sides that they are aping the worst excesses of the black and tans. It was frequently said in 1922 and 1923. So that was certainly there. The discovery that we were more than capable of doing these kind of things to ourselves. Yes, I do think we are ready to face that. There are obviously a generation now who perhaps are not carrying the same amount of inherited fear of confronting that. A lot of the people who are in political life now may well feel that they're not carrying Civil War baggage and that has to be faced squarely. And it's not just an Irish question. You know, we have to remember that what Winston Churchill dismissed as the wars of the pygmies, in other words, the succession wars after the First World War, between 1918 and the early 1920s, of which the Irish Civil War is a part, they killed 4 million people. The wars of the pygmies, you know, Winston Churchill's dismissal of them. And, you know, that's not just about what happened in Ireland, but in Hungary and Finland and Greece and Turkey. And they've all had to deal with their pasts in different ways. There were 36,000 people killed in the Finnish Civil War in a country of similar size and population, and thousands of them were starved to death deliberately, which didn't happen in Ireland, thankfully. So it's a much bigger question about how societies deal with the aftermath of that, or whether they bury it or confront it at different stages. Spain is still grappling with its own Civil War legacy, which of course comes after ours. But we should be ready. We're a very mature democracy. If you look at the countries that managed to retain their democracies throughout these post-Civil War decades, we're in a very small club. Some Finnish political opponents were able to share power in the 1930s. They had ways of dealing with it. So 100 years on, yes, I do think we should be able for that.
I was just I might add very quickly. I was in Helsinki 2 years ago, and I went to the Finnish Museum of History, right, the National Museum, just to see how they marked their Civil War, and it was like a cabinet just like that, and that was it.
Yeah.
And I was going, where's the rest of it?
Yeah.
Whereas they have a huge display in relation to the Winter War of 1939, 1940. So we're not the only country that has problems with this.
No, and I mean, sometimes less is more,
Yeah.
as people would see it when it comes to Civil War commemoration.
Anybody else? Questions?
Maybe while we're waiting, I'll give you a question from the online audience. That's okay. So Eileen, watching online, asks, were there many people who started off on the anti-treaty side and changed when they saw the will of the people?
No, I don't. There's not much evidence of that that I found. Now, if that question is about TDs, I'm not sure. If it is about TDs, yes, I think there would have been wavering. When you consider the Christmas break in particular, that came, the treaty debates were held over December and 1921 and January 1922, and there was a lot of pressure when people went back to their constituencies, and there was pressure from church leaders as well, which we didn't get time to go into, but that's an important factor as well when it comes to some of those moral questions you were talking about. The church is much more vocal during the Civil War than it had been during the War of Independence. The bishops are broadly pro-treaty. That would have influenced, I think, some of the TDs, because it was believed at one point in December that it was likely that the vote would be lost, that the anti-treaty side would prevail. But also constituents maybe putting pressure on their TDs. And it raised this interesting question, was the Dáil that debated the treaty representative of those constituents? These were TDs who had been returned unopposed in the summer of 1921 to the Dáil. And there's an interesting question there. It goes back to what you asked about the June 1922 election as well. Was the split in the Dáil representative of how people were feeling nationally? Perhaps not. I'm sure there were individuals too who would have been minded to carry on fighting, but then decided that they wouldn't. I think that was more likely than going to the other side. In other words, people who were anti-treaty wouldn't lose that conviction, but they might lose the intensity of their feeling to the extent that they were not prepared to fight. But it didn't mean they were prepared to go over to the National Army side.
There's a gentleman here on the... Is he... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
This might be a slightly offbeat comment, but I was thinking what you said about Michael Collins. I wondered about the fact that because he was young, he was good looking, and let's face it, quite a virile-looking man. Was that, in a sense, really why he has been frozen? Because I was leaving school in '75, and you had, the president who seemed to have gone on and on and on up in the auras. So we had Paul Durcan writing the mocking poem, Making Love in front of Áras an Uachtaráin. Was there a cry for let us lift this repression, please? That's my question.
I can still see him now in the heat haze of the day, blindly stalking us down and levelling an ancient gun. He says, "Stop making love," outside Áras an Uachtaráin. It was a great. It captured, I suppose, that sense of a relic in the park, as Durcan would have seen it at the time. Somebody who had been there far too long, and he wouldn't have been alone in that view. But I think there's absolutely, definitely something in that. And would James Dean be remembered as much as he is if he was not blessed with good looks? Obviously, Collins had that going for him. And as Ronan mentioned, he's very young when he dies. He, in that sense, doesn't live for all the disappointments that can come with long life, to be part of him, including the physical part. And George Bernard Shaw wrote to Michael Collins' sister just after he died, and told her to hang out her brightest colours, and be grateful that he didn't live to be an old man lying in bed with a trumpery cough, inevitably disappointed about all the failures that would have attended his life had he lived. Perhaps a tad insensitive to be writing to Collins, but you could see the point he was making. So there's definitely something in that. And I mean, Collins, you can see that during the period of the treaty negotiations. It's not just about the whiff of sulphur, and obviously this one of the most wanted men is now in Downing Street. But there's also that sense of Collins being in intense demand when it comes to London society. And a lot of women are involved in that as well. And, his virility, you can debate. I think Peter Hart, the late Peter Hart, one of his biographers, is pretty confident that he died a virgin. When I mentioned that some years ago, I got into awful trouble. But you'd be happy to know, I don't know about Michael Collins' sex life beyond whatever hints might exist in certain letters between himself and Katie Kiernan. But absolutely, this is again part of the dashing lost leader. And it does embellish him and his reputation. And it also, I think you're right, it allows that image to be sustained as others grow old.
Brendan, do you have a question?
Another one from the online audience. So, yes. Somebody asked, with all of the brutality on both sides during the Civil War, why was there a smooth rapprochement after the war? I don't know if it was smooth, but...
There's a strong emphasis in the aftermath of the Civil War on what that both sides have in common. 94% of the population of the new Free State was Catholic. That's a binding agent. And of course, it's another issue altogether as to how that allegiance was used and how that power was used and abused. That, to me, is another one of the legacies of the Civil War, but it's another hour. So that's part of it. The GA plays a role as well. When you think about binding agents, and the sense of finding a common playing ground. And even eventually the Garda Síochána becomes a force that both sides can find a home in. So it's partly about that. It's also partly about their allegiances predating the Civil War. They had things in common before the Civil War. Many of them, of course, had fought together during the War of Independence. But I also think it's because a democratic culture in Ireland predated the Civil War. And this is where we're different than some other countries that I mentioned earlier on in the post-First World War period. We had that tradition, and that helps to achieve a degree of stability and a respect for the democratic institutions. Not everybody, of course. There are many who can't reconcile themselves to the state. And also, and it's cruel, but it's true, a lot of the troublemakers were gone. There is that exodus. Again, going back to West Kerry, about 40% of the IRA men from West Kerry during the Civil War were gone by the 1930s. There is, in a sense, a layer of trouble that is exported, and that creates great difficulties for many of those individuals. But there's also, I think, a determination to try and come to terms with the excesses of the Civil War by making a priority of politics. When you look even during the Second World War at the premium attached to the idea of sovereignty and going our own way, both sides of the Civil War buy into that. And both sides of the Civil War actually serve in the defence forces during the Second World War and in the local defence forces as well. And then they also work together when it comes to the pensions process. The old IRA men's associations, in many respects, became welfare organisations. And again, from both sides of the Civil War, what they have in common is they want to see a pensions process that will work for both sides. And sometimes they can even write on behalf of each other, which would have taken quite a lot for some of them. So I think there are a number of different themes there.
Anybody else? Oh, there's a gentleman at the back there.
My name is Vincent Kelly, and my question to you would be, as an historian, would you be optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Northern Ireland?
You have to be pessimistic to be a historian. No, go on, sorry.
No, the reason I ask is that we're always told that the team that went to London were up against politicians who were really hard-nosed, experienced, both politicians, civil servants and military. So how would you compare the team that the Irish team had to negotiate with in Britain at the time in 10 Downing Street versus the people who were in 10 Downing Street at the moment?
Well, I was lucky before lockdown to be in the archives in London looking at the correspondence of David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. And whatever about their minds being saturated with imperialism, particularly Winston Churchill, what is so striking is the cleverness with which they can express themselves, the depth of their range and their views. We have to appreciate that Ireland was a small part of a very large imperial jigsaw. They're concerned about what's going on in Iraq and in Greece and in Palestine and in India. We forget that sometimes, just how insignificant we are. And Winston Churchill, as Secretary of State for Colonies, is corresponding with Lloyd George about all those different matters. But what strikes me, I suppose, is the maturity that they had as practitioners of politics. David Lloyd George was leading a coalition government and had all sorts of different individuals to satisfy, including those who were termed as the diehards, but also the strategies that they employed, the capacity to speak out of different sides of their mouths. They did that to a sophisticated degree, which is not something you will find in Downing Street at the moment. You are, and again, this isn't about ideological preferences. I'm talking about politics and how serious the business of politics was taken. It's been debased. The idiocy that we've witnessed in recent times and the debasement of public discourse, of political debate, and of politics as an art. So that really strikes me. And obviously those, you talked about the future and being optimistic for the future. Coming out of a civil war, a study of the Civil War, your fervent hope is always, of course, that wounds are not reopened to the extent that people feel it's necessary for battles to be fought again. That, as long as there's an acceptance, a broad acceptance, that whatever issues remain, and there are many of them, and as Ronan mentioned, these are not closed issues by any means, as we've seen from recent events, that they will, despite sometimes the ferociousness of their rhetoric, that they will keep with dialogue and stick with dialogue. I'm struck by what's changed dramatically in Northern Ireland in relation to the loss of unionist supremacy and dominance. That's a huge cultural change for unionism as well as a political change, and it's one of the reasons why they're flailing and struggling at the moment in relation to the coherence of their identity. That is going to change Northern Ireland, And yet, do we think enough about the others? You know, we still have a tendency, obviously, and maybe understandably, to think about the two communities or the two sides. There's a very substantial third grouping in Northern Ireland who don't identify with the traditional sides. And they too are the future of Northern Ireland. So, you know, I think that's a cause for optimism, and it comes back to, I suppose, a point about generational change and what people are prioritising. And, you know, you would hope that that more diverse complexion and perhaps more broad-ranging identifications and identities will leave Northern Ireland in a better place.
Well, on that upbeat note, I'd like to thank Professor Diarmaid Ferriter for a fascinating talk, to thank all of you for waiting for so long here today. We could talk for another hour about this subject, but some other day. Thank you.
And thank you all for taking the trouble to come here. It really is lovely to see people in audiences again, and I really appreciate the time you made.
Well, thank you very much, Diarmaid and Ronan. Ladies and gentlemen, before you leave us, I just want to tell you that we can't have the normal book signing due to the COVID restrictions, but Diarmaid has signed copies of his book, and they're available to purchase from the Gutter Bookshop out in the lobby. And just to remind you, our next event is at 7:30 p.m. This evening. It features the Irish Assassins, Conspiracy, Revenge and the Murders That Stunned an Empire, and that's Julie Kavanagh in conversation with Roy Foster. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again to Diarmaid and Ronan.